Robby, what's on your radar?
So young people are much more fearful of cancel culture than older Americans, but they're also, paradoxically, more supportive of it, according to a new report by the Manhattan Institute's Eric Kauffman that surveys public attitudes toward various culture war items like critical race theory, free speech on college campuses, diversity training, other subjects that I write about and that Ryan and I and Kim discuss on the show with some frequency. So Kauffman analyzed polling data from a variety of surveys and found that 45% of working people under the age of 30 were afraid of losing their jobs because, quote, someone misunderstands something you have said or done, takes it out of context, or posts something from your past online, i.e. the kind of social sanction typically described as cancel culture. Among Americans 55 and older, just 29% had this same fear. But if younger millennials and members of Gen Z have more to fear from cancel culture, well, they're also much more willing to say that these terms are acceptable. By a 48 to 27 margin, respondents under 30 agree that my fear of losing my job or reputation due to something I said or posted online is a justified price to pay to protect historically disadvantaged groups, noted Kauffman. Those over 50, by contrast, disagree by a 51 to 17 margin. Younger age brackets are both more fearful of cancel culture, more supportive of it than our older age groups. So Kauffman pushes back against the idea that there's a hypocrisy here. On the contrary, it seems that many young people are taking an almost self-sacrificial attitude. He writes, rather than viewing such individuals as thin-skinned or inconsistent, we should consider them to be adhering to a consistent set of ideas that places the emotional safety and advancement of minority groups above their personal freedom of expression. Kauffman continues, quote, an individual aged 18 to 25 who fears cancellation has a nearly 60% chance of agreeing that this is a justifiable price to pay in order to protect minorities, compared with only 10% of the oldest survey respondents who fear being canceled. So that's just one finding of the report, which describes young people's affinity for what it calls cultural socialism, a worldview that values equal results and harm prevention for identity groups over individual rights and has inspired race-based pedagogies and harsh punishments for controversial speech. Now, Kauffman contrasts this with cultural liberalism, the presumption in favor of free speech, individuality, and due process that comprises the older default way of thinking about social issues. So I think these categorizations are somewhat crude, and it's hard to say what's specifically socialist about the newer attitudes. Indeed, thinking that the government ought to prevent private employees from disciplining employees over a misunderstanding or prior social media post, that could actually be described as the more socialist stance. Nevertheless, the survey results are interesting, and the responses to this question and many others all point in the same direction. Young people, far more supportive of what we describe as cancel culture. Take a look at these two graphs. While ideology remains the very best predictor of support for cancel culture, with progressives supporting it and conservatives opposing it, age was a remarkably useful proxy. Cancel culture drew some support from young Republicans even, for instance. Kauffman writes, quote, younger respondents are significantly more politically biased, even controlling for party identification, race, and gender. Some 55% of Biden voters, 25 and under, would not hire a Trump supporter for a job, dropping to 39% for the 26 to 49 age group and 29% for those over 50. Only 23% of young Biden supporters said that they would be comfortable having lunch with a Trump supporter, compared with 42% of Biden voters over 25. So Kauffman's report does not paint a pretty picture of the future for my group, libertarians. Younger Americans are both more supportive of cancel culture and more interested in using the power of the state to right perceived wrongs. While older Republicans have more of a libertarian streak and are less willing to consider government action as the right solution, young Republicans have no such hang-ups, indicating a possible generational shift within the GOP base toward a more interventionist and less libertarian form of conservatism. So I thought this study was interesting. It confirms, I guess, a lot of what maybe rings true to us. It's, militantly progressive young people who are the enforcers of this, even though they know it is most likely to harm them. That's kind of interesting. They are perfectly aware that this comes back to haunt them. That people in their group, maybe they don't think it's going to be them specifically, in their friend groups, their peer groups, their social groups, their working groups, are going to be fired for something they tweeted when they were 14. They know that, but they think it is justified in order to right historic wrongs, to make minorities, people down the intersectional hierarchy, feel more comfortable and more emotionally safe.
Got to admire that consistency.
Yeah, right. It's not. I was saying
Right.
this is not hypocrisy. This is the
Right.
opposite of hypocrisy.
Yeah, it's
this
really
is self-sacrifice.
The part that made me the saddest in that maybe was the unwillingness to have lunch with a Trump supporter.
It's crazy, right?
Because I feel like even just from a pragmatic perspective, like if you want to see your social values become hegemonic across the culture, which you have to want, and if you don't want that, then what are you doing? You're just like a sports fan, like rooting for a losing team, and that you're not even part of. It's like, so unless you want your values to be shared by other people and to spread across the country, then you're not engaged in politics. And the only way to spread that, to do politics, is to engage with people that don't already share those values. And you have to find where it is that you agree on something common down here and something common in an end goal, and then find the areas where you disagree and figure out which ones are just can't be resolved, and which ones you can set aside, or you can reorient around your other common values to get to the place that you want to be. Because they'll find, if they sit down with people, that a lot of them have the same frustrations and the same goals, but they just live in completely different media ecosystems, and not just media ecosystems, but academic ones, literary ones, podcast ones, and that if the people flipped sides at the lunch counter and lived through the media life and the academic life that the other was living through, they might just believe the things that the person on the opposite side says.
There's also an important asymmetry here, because so many more people on the liberal left progressive side don't want to associate or have conversations or even lunch with a Trump supporter, but the reverse is less true. So it creates a dynamic where people who hold conservative views are, self-censoring or more reluctant in many social situations to share that or to tell you about their political views. But the people on the other side do not feel that same fear. So like they're happy to be as political or like in your face about their politics. Republicans are not, because they know they have to be quiet.
Yeah, well, and a Canadian leftist that we talked about on the show earlier, I think her name was Emma Jackson, who wrote an interesting piece for a magazine called The Breach up there. She was saying, look, we have to acknowledge that the right is doing a better job organizing our own friends and family than we are. So before we can talk about organizing a national and then global movement, how about we talk our family and friends into agreeing with us first? But if you don't talk to people who, unless they already agree with you, then guess what? The other side will be evangelizing its point of view and will win them over.
Yeah. Push Joe Rogan into the other camp. Make sure Hillary Clinton doesn't give any speeches in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Demonize everyone who's anti-science if they're uncomfortable with this vast new government takeover of what we're allowed to wear on our faces. It's a great strategy, working really well so far.
Although there's no evidence Hillary actually going to those states helps, unfortunately.
So?
If she were a candidate where it would help, if she showed up, she would have won. But your general point, I completely agree with.
Fair enough. Well, I'm looking forward to your radar coming up next.